Blanco.
Thank you very much for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. Okay, we're trying to figure out. I was talking to what's his name? El italiano? Fiorenzo. I was talking to that PowerPoint presentation is like opera. You can rehearse, but when the show comes, you never know what's going to happen with this. Okay, it's working. All right, again, so thank you very much for the invitation. I think this type of symposiums are great because we integrate knowledge, we integrate consciousness about what we do with other people in other fields. And so let me talk a little bit about my field. I'm a musician native from Venezuela. And since very early, I've been fascinated by the music of the world. And being from Venezuela, of course, I had started to study the influence we have in my country and in my neighbor countries and in Latin America. So because this is such a fascinating topic to me, I can go on for quite some time. So I kind of going to read a little bit, try to keep it online, and I'm going to maybe leave a little bit more of time and space for questions because I think that's very important for me. It is very important, the interaction and the questions you have and reflections you have on regard of what I'm going to talk about here. So, as again, I've been doing for more than 20 years research in the influence of African diaspora influence in Latin America. It is very contradictory that such a tragedy and criminal act as it was the transatlantic slavery trade has resulted in one of the greatest and most fascinating cultural exchange in the history of civilization. Still nowadays, in my view, we are far away to fairly recognize the heritage and impact of the African diaspora culture in the music of Western civilization, especially of the Americas. Part of this is because such a shame. It's a shame to Western civilization to recognize this. But ultimately, it is Western civilization, or to be more specific, Eurocentric view, the ones who wrote the history of this tragedy. And it's important for us not only to know what happened, in this case about the African slavery trade, but why and how. So as much shame and painful it could be, this topic, I don't believe it is beneficial to anyone to only look and admire the benefits of it. That is the African cultural heritage into the Americas, without looking at the whole story. We musicians often make the mistake of study the music of only of what we are interested on, and if we become a little bit more wider in perspective, we start studying world music, but we make the mistake to study the styles of music by nations. And that's a big mistake, because nations are land and culture divided by imperialistic, economic, or let's say political reasons, right? For example, I give you a good example. From Venezuela, and Carlos Capacho here is a great cuatro player, knows very much this, that we have a style of music called joropo, right? And we Venezuelans make always the mistake of saying like, joropo is the Venezuelan style, or is the style of Venezuelan. And it's not. Joropo is a style of music we share with our brothers from Colombia. And the reason we share this music and the reason this specific style of music exists in Venezuela and in part of Venezuela and part of Colombia is because it's a specific region. There are the plains of Venezuela and Colombia that we both countries share together. So joropo is played in both sides of this imaginary and now political division between two countries. And the style of music, like many other styles of music around the world, has to do more with the geographics and topography of the land than a political division of the land. For example, the plains in Venezuela and Colombia, there are huge extensions of land. And the activity, that extension of land is to say, the culture is the cowboys of Venezuela and Colombia. So the activity, one of the activity is to go gather the cattle, right? To gather them and then milk them. So you can go, people, the cowboys of Venezuela and Colombia have two ways to do this, in horse or walking, right? So if they do this, they wake up very early in the morning and walk huge extensions of land where they have to gather all of them. And so they start singing things like, mariposa, mariposa. It sounds like a song, it sounds like singing, but they're really calling the names of the cows, of each of the cows. But they have to scream it really loud and long so their voice travels through this space. So that's the origin of one of the styles, also from this region, which is the tonada, which is sung a cappella, because you're going for an activity, you're not carrying your instrument. And then it's also the confession of the peasants, workers, milking the cows alone in solitary. They start confessing their love affairs and all kinds of problems to the cow, which is not going to repeat it, right? And so that's, if you want to check out this style, how it became music, please check out an amazing composer we had in Latin America, happens to be born in Venezuela, is Simón Díaz or Simón Diaz. I don't know how you say it in English, but it's Simón Díaz, right? Okay, so this style of music is defined, again, by geographics, topography of the land, right? And I believe it is very important for musicians to be always conscious of this and not fall into the mistake of, say, what is the music they play in Cuba, what is the music they play in the Dominican Republic, what is the music they play in Spain or in Portugal, because there could be such huge divisions and distinctions within one country, that is a political country, between the styles of music which are shaped by other motifs that are not the political ones. I'll give you another example. Which we're going to talk a lot about the influence of African diaspora music in the Americas. Everybody knows about that the Americas, especially in Hispanic America, and later I'll talk the division, why there is a distinction between Hispanic America and Anglo America in terms of music, is that in Hispanic America it's very easy to find the influence from either European or African, or at least it's more apparent. And the indigenous music, it was mostly wiped out of the continent. There are many reasons for this. One of those is because when the arrival and invasion of European colonizers into the Americas, besides bringing their greed for economical extraction, they also brought a lot of viruses and sickness who infected the indigenous, who were not, the immune system were not ready for this, and a lot of them died, right? That's one of the reasons. Then, of course, the cultural dominion against the indigenous. However, if you want to hear what is left of indigenous music in the Americas, we have to, and still current today, we have to listen to music from some parts of Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. And why is that? So when we go to the main places still in Europe or here and in Times Square or in London, we hear people with indigenous atelier playing indigenous instruments, flutes, pan flutes, and the music from these countries, from Bolivia, Ecuador. That music is preserved because of the geography and topography of the land. When Europeans brought African slaves to the Americas, they didn't reach the high altitudes of certain lands. In Bolivia and Peru, that's called the Andes. And that's why it's preserved that way, and it sounds different than in other places. It sounds different than the other styles of other places in the Americas. So it is important to be conscious of what shapes the music, and this is valid for all around the world, not only for the Americas. So I was always wondering why the music, talking about the music of the Americas, why in the Caribbean music sounded much more African than in other places of the Americas. And there are many reasons, but for a long time I thought that this hypothesis, which is true, but it's not the only one. When the European colonizers massively kidnapped people from Africa and removed them from their homeland, to them brought them to a new land for work and purposes, first of all, they mixed all the slaves in Africa, where they gathered them to transport them to the Americas. They mixed them between people from different villages. The reason of this is because they thought that if they could not communicate verbally in the same language, there would be less risk for rebellion. So first they did that, then brought them into the Americas. The ones who survived landed in the Caribbean. So just for the fact of mixing all these different African people, mix them with people they could not communicate verbally, that imposes already in the America a natural fusion music as traditional music. In other words, we have this Pan-African phenomenon in the Americas. And they brought them to the Caribbean because if you look at the map, it's a direct trip and easy to go to the Caribbean than going to the other side of the Americas and the Pacific. So the Caribbean became also a market for slaves. Most of these islands became a market for slaves for people from Peru and Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico will travel to the Caribbean to buy slaves. So as you already noticed, the topic I'm going to be talking is very difficult, but it's very necessary to talk about. Because still today in the 21st century, we're still seeing and living the repercussions of slavery and racism. And not only here in the United States, but in Latin America, which we have the misconception that because we are all more mixed in color, and because somebody in Venezuela can tell me, hey, negro, tócate piano, play piano. And it's not an insult. People think that there is no racism by calling somebody in Latin America negro or negrito. And then when you come here, it's like, hey, don't say that word because it's politically incorrect here. So that's really interesting for Latin Americans coming here and say, like, we cannot say that word, which is very common. And then we have the misconception that in our countries in Latin America, there is no racism. That's false, but it's hidden in a different way. But we'll get into that. So when they brought all these African slaves, and we even have to be careful, I have to be careful about the proper terminology, because usually we say when they brought the Africans or when they brought the slaves, as if everybody in Africa in that period were born as slaves. That's not true. So it's important sometimes to be careful to make the distinction that enslaved Africans. They brought him here for a different reason I later discovered, and it was sugar. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit today, right? So as a musician, it's important to have this broader view of how music evolves. Again, we musicians think like, what is the rhythm they play here, and what is the rhythm they play in Brazil, what is the rhythm they play in other places. And we don't look at, for example, the economy and political reasons of how our content is being divided, right? So let's talk about misconceptions, right? So I remember going to school, an elementary school in Venezuela, and still being told that Columbus, one of the main motivations of Columbus to travel and discover new routes is because a lot of people thought that the earth was plain, it was not rounded, and eventually you were going to fall at the end of the limit of the earth, and there were all kind of monsters that were going to swallow you. But that's a misconception. When Columbus was alive, most people knew already that the earth was rounded, it was a sphere, and they just didn't have all the cartography right in place, right? So this is important because it shows the importance of history. And not only the importance of history, but who writes it and who gets to tell the history, right? So again, in Latin America, even when we talk about music, most of music education in Western civilization are based in one view and one story and one history, and that's the Eurocentric perspective of it, right? The fact that we have 5 lines called music staff, the fact that we have from do to do only 12 pitches instead of 50 that they could have in India or in Romania, show us how limited we are in the study of music in Western civilization. That we believe that music has to be studied in this perspective. And even in Asia, if you go to music school, you are taught in the Western civilization perspective. And that's, besides very unfair, is very limited. And it takes us in our brain, limited perspective of this is how we study music and this is how we understand music. And because of that, it makes it very difficult for many people to understand rhythms from Africa, pitches from other parts of the world, from India, for example, which is a very complex and sophisticated system, the one in music from India. And when we hear rhythms from Africa, we try to transcribe it in our own grid, in terms of metronome, and we don't understand that sometimes rhythm in Africa, they flow different, and they are taught different. They are not taught by the N of 1 or the N of 4 and the downbeat. No, they are taught by onomatopoeic and on words that they created, and they transmit this information to other generations. So that's another important fact that it's important for musicians, from educators, from students, and from musicians in general, to know this fact, because it can incentivize us to find more of what sometimes, unfortunately, still now we don't find currently in schools, with some exceptions of people who are doing this research and presenting it in the school communities. All right. So Columbus discovered this new land and says, well, this is not India, right? Let me talk a little bit about the history of sugar. So I'll give you some timelines here. It started in the East. The Muslims, after translating Greek ancient texts and exchanging knowledge from India, the Middle East learned the secret of sugar. Sugar was now a Muslim luxury, a sign of wealth and generosity of Islamic emperors and kings. When the rise of Islam Egypt became the world's great sugar laboratory. The inventions of the plantation concept is a Muslim invention. The Muslim worked out a new form of farming and handling sugar, which came to be called the sugar plantation. And the plantation was not, it was a technology, and it was based on organizing, planting, growing, cutting, and refining a crop, the sugar cane, which is that happens for the first time in Middle East. Since sugar couldn't even feed the workers of the plantation, thus, for the first time in human history, a farm is run to only satisfy the craving of buyers who could be thousands of miles away. So sugar became a luxury also in Europe, even more, because it was not easy to bring all these spices. So when the Spanish Peninsula, or the Spaniards and Portuguese, finally were able to liberate themselves from the Moors in North Africa, they start relating and bringing important spices from India and Middle East. And it was a very difficult thing to do, precisely because they could not pass through the north of Africa. They will have to go through the ocean. And it became very expensive. Portuguese were neighbors. They have a great technology in the seas, and they discovered not only the route to go to the Middle East, but they also discovered a way to go to sub-Saharan Africa, which nobody else could do, because there was kind of like a different water currents in the ocean that will sink all the ships trying to pass the Saharan desert from the coast, from the western coast of Africa. So Spaniards wanted to also get into the business of bringing spices, and among those spices from India, it was sugar. So they sent off Columbus to discover a new route to India. And that's what the past picture shows. Columbus travels and say, oh, my mistake, this is not India. But since the purpose was a growing economy, they say, well, this could work great for us. We don't even have to buy from the Arabs the spices. We can grow it here ourselves, produce it, and then ship it to Europe, right? This is one of the markets, and I say that this is one of the beginnings of globalization. The fairs provided a place for merchants to meet with other merchants to do business in an economy that did not have and could not sustain permanent trading centers. The fair gave regularity to merchants' wanderings and offered a place where he knew he could find other merchants, trade for the commodities and supplies he needed, and sell commodities he was carrying. As the European economy grew during the 11th and 12th centuries, overland trade between Italy and Northeast Europe increased. So now we know that the main reason of Spanish kingdoms pursuing Columbus' venture was to find a shorter way to Asia. And the reason of such an investment of time, human, and material asset was no other than the importance of Asia in the world's commerce at the time. Let me give you a little history of the sugar refinement. The extraction of sugar cane juice from the sugar cane plant and the subsequent domestication of the plant in tropical Southeast Asia, sometimes around 8000 BC. The invention of manufacture of sugarcane granules from the sugarcane juice in India a little over 2000 years ago, followed by improvement of refining the crystal granules in India in the early centuries, after the Christ era. The spread of cultivation and manufacture of sugarcane to the medieval Islamic world, together with some improvements of production methods, the development of beet sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and other sweeteners in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's very, very recent. So the Caribbean became basically the sugar plantation of Europe. And slavery existed before the colonization of the Americas. As a matter of fact, the word slave comes from the word Slavic. That's where the word slave comes from. So there was already African slaves, and they were not always Africans, by the way. So the Greek Empire used African slaves. The Europeans also kidnapped slaves to bring them to Europe. But there were never before in history that they were in a massive numbers as it was in the colonization of the Americas. So it's interesting that because of economy, the economy of sugar in this case, is a way that we can explain how the music of the Americas evolve, or part of the music of the America evolves, and put aside a lot of misconceptions of history. For example, one of the great misconceptions of this history is, I'll give you an example, tango from Argentina. So basically, most people know that tango comes from Argentina. Well, for a period of time, the French thought that it was French because they love it, because it's a very elitesque dancing with a European instrument, very sexy looking, so the French love it. And also Gardel, one of the major exponents of tango, lived since a very early age in Paris. But tango is from Argentina. Now, I ask you, if you have met any Argentinian, have you ever met any black Argentinian? Yes? One time? Okay, so that's an exception, right? And I went to Argentina, 10 years ago, to Buenos Aires, a fascinating city, and I saw some black people, but they happened to be African tourists. So people think that there were never black people in Argentina, and that's wrong, right? And because of that misconception, people think that tango is let's call it a white Argentinian invention, which is also wrong. What happens at the end of the 1700s, 40% of the population of Buenos Aires were black, 40%. Now, I have gone to many libraries and universities researching about this topic, about the influence of Africa in the Americas. And I have taken the opportunity to have in my hands books from the 3-4 centuries ago, and seen pictures of ancient, not ancient, but very colonial times, early colonial times in Argentina, and there is no one single black person in those pictures, those paintings. So, if 40% of the population of Buenos Aires were black, where did they go? One of the reasons is that they put them in the front lines of wars against Peru, against Chile, and something similar still happens nowadays, right? Where the front lines people in the army in the United States usually are Puerto Ricans or black people. So most of them, a lot of them died, and others flew out of the country. There are black people in Uruguay, not too many, but there are black people, and Uruguay is right next to Argentina, right? And this massive population of black people in Brazil. So the other reason that I left out Brazil, but I need to mention, Brazil, if you look at the map, is right across West Africa, West Sub-Saharan Africa. So the Caribbean and Brazil became the big lands of sugar. So tango became tango preceded by another style of music, which is called milonga, right? And in the milonga, we still can find something, a proto-rhythm, I call it proto-rhythm, that originated from El Cinquillo. And by the way, this is a book that Danilo gave me a long time ago when I was studying with him about the binarizations or ternary rhythms. And the Cinquillo is a combination of 5 notes, right? Regardless of the time signature. It's a group of 5 notes that is usually this, ta, 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 but it has many different permutations, variation of that. Another one is ta, 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 ta. And if you tied some of them, for example, ta, 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 or ta, 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 you have ta, 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 you have the first part of the clave. So there are different theories of how the cinquillo traveled all the way from Cuba, quote Cuba, and I'm going to explain why they quote, all the way down to Argentina in a style called habanera. But before the habanera came from the contradanza habanera. And the contradanza habanera is, the contradanza word itself is a mispronunciation of the English country dance. That in Cuban they say country dance, la contradanza, right? Which became then the habanera, which traveled all to Argentina. That became the habanera Argentina or habanera Uruguaya. Which later becomes a milonga, and it still have this dong, ding, ding, dong, ding, ding of the milonga, right? Which is a very typical bass line pattern of the milonga. And that milonga became later the tango with the Europeization of the style, because the rhythm become more tight and heavy into the downbeat. Now I'm going to make a little parenthesis there and say that one of the fascinating things that I discovered through this book and later all more research is that because of our Eurocentric view of studies of music, among other fields, ternary subdivision of the pulse was very rare in European music until relatively very recent. In other words, when I talk about the subdivision, I'm talking about how naturally will people subdivide the pulse, right? So I'm generalizing here, of course, which is a big mistake. I don't like to do generalizations, but just for the fact of explaining this. Most people in Europe, in the old times, if you give them the beat, they will tend to subdivide the beat in 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, and the derivatives of 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and so on. So you go to elementary music school, and they teach you the whole note, and they say, this is 4 beats or 4 pulses. And then the next lesson, they say, okay, and 2 half notes, which obviously is half of the whole note. And then the next lesson is the quarter note, which is a binary subdivision of the half notes. And then the 8th note. And if you're still interested in music, you go to another class and say, well, now that you're still here, I'm going to teach you about a new device, which is you get 3 notes and you put a little rainbow and put a 3, and that's the triplets. Oh, wow, that's more sophisticated. And you think about it, is why subdividing the pulse in 3 becomes more sophisticated than subdividing it in 2, right? And the fascinating thing is that the subdivision, or the natural subdivision in 3, is one of the heritage we have from sub-Saharan Africa. That's not to say that all music in sub-Saharan Africa is a ternary group of music. No, they have also binary music. But there's a lot of subdivisions in ternary, right? So we have these 2 worlds where we subdivide pulse and rhythms and music either in binary or in ternary. And those 2 worlds we got here in the Americas by having Africans mixed, a Pan-African phenomenon, with European music. So going back to the milonga and to Argentina. In Argentina, in one period of time when the British were ruling, administrating Argentina, they wanted to bring more manpower, and they offer, after the First World War, a lot of Europeans to come to Argentina. There's a lot of work, you make good money, and then you can afford to, then you can either go back to your home country in Europe or bring your wives and family to Argentina. It didn't happen as promised, right? So a lot of Europeans went to Argentina and worked, they never made the money they're supposed to make to either come back to Europe or bring their families. And because this fact, Argentina became an unbalanced land of much more men than women. The ratio of male and female became disproportional. And of course, with having this disproportion in gender, prostitution became very profitable and very popular business. So they have their area of brothels where they have the entertaining men, and it became so competitive and so popular that between each brothel, they were competing to retain men in the queue. And one of the devices or the strategies they used to keep their men in their queue and not going to the next one was musicians. So they will send musicians to entertain men in these queues, and of course, they started dancing and they became entertained. And also, the men in that time, to have any chance to meet a woman, they'll have to learn how to dance. So they were dancing milonga. That was the style of music they were dancing, with black Argentinian musicians, most of them playing it. Which later, the milonga become more relied into a strong one. And the ta, 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 ta became more ta, 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 more straight, right? And there's a gradual transition that you can still hear from milonga into tango, right? So that's a huge misconception of the importance of who writes the history. And that has to do with national identity. National identity is a design of image that nations get to decide, political decision of how they want their nation viewed for the rest of the world. So apparently, Argentina as a nation, and arguably still, don't want to recognize that they had black people. And that's wrong, besides inaccurate, right? Also, what do we know about black people living in Mexico? Of course there were black people living in Mexico, and there still are. But all we know about Mexico is the very rich Aztec culture, which is amazing. And of course, the Mexicans say, well, let's show this part. And they don't show much the richness of the music of Veracruz. There has a lot of, and a very important African descendant population in Mexico, and so on. So what do we know, for example, of black population in Peru and in Ecuador and in Colombia? Not much. I mean, if you're not Latin American, if you're not interested in these topics, the only time, still that now, you see black people from Ecuador and Peru in a worldwide stage is in the World Cup, in the football teams, which 90% of the players are black. Why is this? Why they are not doctors? Why they are not engineers? I'm sure they are, but not as much, because they don't have the same opportunity in society to study these other careers. So if you're in a society that have this domination against race, the only way you have to overcome those limitations, and still nowadays it happens, is mainly through two fields, arts and sports. The other field is mixing with white population, so you expect your generation coming up to have better opportunities. And we need to know this fact to understand, in the world we live in today, and more importantly, that we musicians, we're not only entertainers, we're not only making music, because my motivation of the Sugar Road, which of course I'm giving a much shorter version here, is that we are a vital part of society, because we can tell the story, we can narrate history through stories that opens the soul of everybody, because we go through ears and soul. but it's important also to know the facts. So when we transmit this story and these facts, we know where it comes from and we make people think about it. So I'm sure there are a lot of economic historians talking about the sugar economy in the Americas. But I didn't find, until now, much of the history of sugar or the history of music of the America through sugar. So the Caribbean became very much the exponent of African music and the north of South America, Venezuela, Colombia, right? More than other countries, and of course Brazil. But the reason of this is because the proximity and the advantage of trading sugar. So it's really interesting how sugar shaped the music of Latin America. Another misconception that we need to know is that Afro-Peruvian music became known relatively very recent. And the irony of why it became more well known is because white people in Lima, Peru, who were mixed from different European countries, at one point they felt threatened that it was a huge exodus of indigenous people from the interior of Peru coming into Lima. And of course, the indigenous people of Peru has a very strong culture in everywhere, culture in food, in their clothing, and of course in their music. And Europeans in Lima became threatened with this because the only way they could fight back, it was with a strong culture, which they didn't have because they were all European mixed from different places and they didn't have their culture. So what they did is they hired historians to search about the almost completely lost culture of African Peruvians. And by searching and taking Afro-Peruvian culture up, it was their weapon to counter-arrest the invasion of indigenous Peruvian culture. So those are really interesting facts to know, right? Of course, I already know I have a few minutes and I want to leave some questions and some comments among us. So I guess for a reflection on this point is that first, we still live in an era and in a country, unfortunately, that believes or that take importance away from diversity, right? And I believe, an artist, and that's one of our responsibilities as a musician, because we can realize this very easy, that diversity is, on the contrary, the richness of a culture. The more diverse a culture is, the richer it becomes, right? So all these things about walls in between two nations, which by the way used to be the same land because all California, New Mexico used to be Mexico, if we talk about political land, it all becomes disruptive for the development of culture and the development of society. So that is an important point that we musicians has the power to demonstrate. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening to this perspective. Yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions. If you have some, please go to the microphone. Any questions?
I wanted to ask, so we all know, the trade of slaves from Africa to North and South America and how that changed the music that was played there. And I was wondering how much that happened in Europe, if it happened. Like if there was like a big also trade of slaves going to Europe, either Spain or France or Italy, and if that changed the music that was played there in a certain way. Probably not as much as here, but I want to know to which extent that happened.
Yeah, that's a good question. It did shape the music in Europe too, because remember that Spaniards were invaded for 8 centuries by the Moors. And, without going too far away, flamenco is all but the influence of Moors music and Middle Eastern music and North African music into Spain. And so that's interesting because in the Americas, we got not only the Pan-African mixed, but we also got the Spaniards, who were the main colonizers of Hispanic America, of course, already being a very mixed culture of Arab. And we actually have a lot of words in Spanish that comes from the Middle East. Like, for example, ojalá, like I wish. Ojalá is related to God, to Allah, right? And also not Middle Eastern, but African words. Basically, most of the words in Spanish that has MBA comes from Africa, like mambo, Colombia, samba, cumbia, MB and a vowel. Most of those words come from Africa, but we don't know this because we're not taught in schools about the heritage of African culture in our culture. Another question? Yes.
So I was having a discussion in another class about the differences between colonies that were mostly Catholic and colonies that were mostly Protestant, because especially at that time, Protestantism was very much against dance, very much against self-expression in all sorts of ways, not only for the slaves that they had, but for themselves.
Right.
Whereas Catholics seem to be more kind of try to bring what culture was there into Catholicism. And that's where you get some of the Santeria type stuff. So I wonder if you've noticed that I don't know how that splits up in South America, or if you've noticed any kind of separation in that way in South America.
Yes, very, very, very good comment. So on the voyage of Columbus to discover this new route, they discovered this new land. Of course, they put even more money into it because it's a new land. And the church, the Catholic Church, was a big sponsor of this. Besides, basically, there were two sponsors, the royalty of Spain and the Catholic Church. For the royalty of Spain, their interests were all natural resources, the economy. But for the Catholic Church, in Spain, being invaded by Moorish and being in a competition with Islam, right? They say, well, everybody you find in this new continent, you have to Catholicize it, right? And that will be our capital. So religious is a big factor in also in how music developed. And I think more contrasting rather than Christian and Catholic is also the Anglo-America with the Hispanic America, right? Still in the Constitution of Catholic Church, which is the Bible, right, basically, they say all men are born equal. Of course, they didn't follow this rule literally because they killed a lot of indigenous, right? And they were obviously treating people from Africa, they were not humans. And that's the point, that they were not considered them humans. But still, in the eyes of the Bible and Christianity, all men were born equal. In Anglo-America, there were different reasons why they came to this part, by the way, here in Massachusetts. There was the radical religion of the time in Europe, that I call it sometimes the Taliban of Europe at the time. And they were so radical, they say, no, you cannot follow your way of life here. You have to go somewhere else. And they arrived here. So they were not interested in recruit indigenous into their religion. They were interested in have their own piece of land, where of course they start expanding, but not mixing. Another one is that the Spaniards thought that allowing their slaves to sing, to pray in their own religion, and to dance, the next day they will have a better work day. They will have a better performance in the field. British thought the contrary, that if they would allow the slaves to sing, to dance, and to pray, that would be a very dangerous rebellion aspect in their field.
Wow, please give him a round of applause. Leo Blanco.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, how is everybody feeling? Everybody's feeling okay?